So this is our Simondon reading group on individuation in light of notions of form and information. We're on part 2, chapter 1, section 1, subsection 2. So we're starting from page 215 of the translation. So last week we saw more of this. Yeah, most of this. Sorry, it's chapter 2 we're on. Most of this chapter has been about these different types of colony organisms, corals and hydras and so on, that they have this relative degree of individuation so that they live in these colony forms that have a shared circulatory system or some sort of shared set of functions. And so he's been looking at the way that the information integration corresponds to individuation. So there's like in certain organisms that have a nervous system, there's a transmission of information across the whole body of the organism. Whereas other organisms that either don't have a nervous system or have a less differentiated nervous system will have certain vital functions that are localized. So like in the example of, I think it was an anemone or something like that, the prey catching behavior is localized. So when one of the tentacles is touched, it will try to grasp whatever is touching it and pull it into the mouth. But that's a completely localized phenomenon because all the other tentacles are independent. They just react to the local sensation of touch. But then the response to ingesting some sort of toxin is distributed across the whole colony because the whole colony will eject whatever they've swallowed. And so the one set of responses is localized and specific to one individual tentacle, and then the other responses are general to the whole colony. So when we talk about individuation of living organisms, we have to specify that individuation relative to specific vital functions, and those degrees of individuation can differ from one set of functions to another. So that's basically what we've seen in this chapter so far. And we're going to continue looking at the relationship between information structure and integration and the notion of relative individuality in the vital sphere or in the sphere of living organisms. Okay, so I'll start reading the first page or so, and then we can discuss from there. Okay, subsection 2, regimes of information and rapports between individuals. Is individualization linked to specialization? This question can be posed by considering polymorphic colonies. Polymorphism is often a consequence of budding, and if it is considered that individuality depends on conditions of reproduction, it indeed seems that polymorphism must be considered as linked to individuality. In fact, it turns out that the various buds in a colony of coelenterates do not all develop in the same way. The colony is then composed of individuals that are different from one another due to their form and their mode of functioning. In some hydrantes, like Hydractinia and Clava, the hydrorhiza, I'm not sure about that, hydrorhiza spreads out on a support, a shell inhabited by a hermit crab, in a very tight network and in superposed strata. The hydrantes are born directly from this inclined stolon and stand vertically. In the clava, a short hydrocolus serves as a peduncule for the hydrantes. One part of the hydrantes has a mouth and tentacles. These are the gastrozoids, or nourishing individuals. The other parts, without a mouth, are sterile and very contractile and contort into a spiral, spirozooids or dactylozoids, and then relax and strike the surrounding bodies with their extremity, which contains nematocysts. These would be the defenders of the colony. The others, which are short, sterile, and spine-shaped, are called acanthozoids and are considered to provide shelter. Still others, the gonozoids, yield sexual products. These various parts form a continuous whole. The cenosarc, furrowed by canals, fills the hydrorhiza and binds together the various hydrantes without any discontinuity. Gastrozoids, dactylozoids, and gonozoids are all distinguished in millipores. In Syphonopores, polymorphism is taken even further. These are floating colonies whose various elements originate at the expense of an initial jellyfish, from which the manubrium extends and buds. Nectozoids are found here, which are gastrozoids endowed with a large oscular orifice and very long tentacles. There are also dactylozoids, to which a defensive role is attributed, and gonozoids. Sometimes a flat or leaf-like lamina or phylozoid is supposed to protect the ensemble. According to Rabot, the finality indicated in the names is too accentuated. The role of the zooids is not too clear. It cannot be said that polymorphism results from a physiological division of labor. Indeed, the majority of the functions have been attributed without a veritable examination of the mode of life of these colonies. The acanthozoids are completely useless and lacking in the majority of species. The aviculars of the bryozoans of the chylostome group are merely simple abnormal variations and not defensive organs. Rabot concludes by saying that the polymorphism of coelenterates amounts to localized variations depending on the general metabolism of the siphonospore or hydractinia. Thus, the difference between the life of a polymorphic colony and the life of a non-polymorphic colony is weak. The difference in look is considerable, but the mode of life and the functional properties are almost the same. Polymorphism arises neither from the influence of individuals on one another, nor from the necessity of existence, nor from another influence that determines polymorphism. Only the gastrozoids and gonozoids are individuals that fulfill a function. All the others result in nothing but a deficit. Yeah, lots of zooids of different kinds. Yeah, so there's a lot of sort of technical terms related to these organisms, whatever they are. I think these are kinds of anemones, if I'm not mistaken, but I'm not super confident about that. But some of these technical terms are, I don't know what a hydrocolus or a peduncle is. I think the general idea is relatively straightforward. It's just that in these types of organisms, you have these differentiated colonies, so polymorphic colonies. So the individuals that make up the colony have a variety of different forms, whereas with other organisms, the individuals that make up a colony have the same form, or generally the same form, so that the colony is not differentiated. So he's just going through some of the different forms that these organisms can take on in this colony. And so that's the basic idea here. But he argues, following Rabot, that we can't look at this differentiation, or we can't think of this differentiation as being some sort of division of labor or corresponding to, for example, the division of an organism into organs with specific functions. So the names of these different zooids suggest that they have specific functions, but in reality, the functional specification is pretty limited, and there's no sort of straightforward correspondence between the shape of the general structure of the zooid and the function it's supposed to serve in the colony.
So if the question that he starts this section with is individualization linked to specialization, then at the end of that long paragraph, he talks about how gastrozoids and gonozoids are individuals that fulfill a function, which I guess means that they're specialized. Is the answer to that question yes, then?
I think the general answer is going to be no. I think we'll have to see as we go along, but I think specialization is not going to be a criterion for individuation. I think in the case of the colony, the specialization of functions is sort of a side effect, I guess you could say. So it's not generated by the degree of individuality of the component organisms. The specialization is sort of another. It's like tangential, I guess, to the question of whether or not an individual or whether or not an organism within a colony is an individual, and to what degree they're individuated. So I think it's going to be sort of an independent question. Like the two questions are independent of each other.
Okay, thanks. That makes sense.
Yeah, and so in that last little bit, when he mentions that the gastrozoids and gonozoids fulfill a function, so here he's looking at this set of different forms that occur within the colony, and he's pointing out that only these two forms have a specific function, and then the rest are just they result from a deficit of some kind, so they're imperfect forms of some kind, and so there's no direct relationship between the specialization of these two functions and then the general differentiation of the colony as a whole.
That makes sense. So he refers to them as individuals, but not because they're specialized. They just happen to also be specialized.
Yeah, and they're individuals only in a relative sense. So they
right.
they have a certain degree of individuality, but because they share other functions, they have a collective side to them as well. But yeah, so they're individuals, and then some of those individuals are specialized, but that's a independent question. Okay, so we can go on to the next page if someone else would like to read.
I can read the next 2-page paragraph, maybe like page and a half. Furthermore, it can be wondered if the relation among individuals allows us to define different degrees of individuality. Relative to reproduction, gestation, viviparity, and ovoviviparity represent different modes and different types of relation. It is important to note that these relations are also found in cases that do not concern reproduction, but a certain form of association, like parasitism. There is even a profound functional analogy between the gestation of viviparous animals in cases of parasitism, like that of Monostroloida or Saculina. There are even cases of association constituted by a reciprocal parasitism of two individuals contemporaneous with one another. These cases are valuable for the theory of information systems. In some sense, they allow us to establish identities concerning the regime of information in the inter-individual relation, where a morphological examination would find nothing but superficial resemblances that we wouldn't dare to qualify as analogies, since the identity of rapport, which are constitutive for analogy, wouldn't appear to be very clear here. According to this path, it becomes possible to characterize quite a few relations relative to a single type of inter-individual rapport taken as a basis, that of reproduction. We are hypothetically treating the elementary forms of association, parasitism, as complements of reproduction. Indeed, when an individual has become completely autonomous, like an 11, that both swims and nourishes itself all on its own, this new individual is born absolutely. In contrast, when a relation continues to exist between the parent and the young in the form of humoral nutritive interdependence, like when the fertilized ovule becomes implanted in the uterus according to a definite mode of placentation until birth, properly speaking, a phase of association that diminishes the embryo's degree of individualization will be inserted between reproduction, properly speaking, division of the egg, and the moment of full individuality. Even after birth, the young individual must be considered as still imperfectly individualized. The relation to the parent extends for a longer or shorter time in the suckling phase, sometimes in an ongoing means of transportation, the marsupial pouch, bats, which is still akin to parasitism with an external fixation. We should further note that certain cases of parasitism are made possible by the fact that several animals have organs, folds, or appendices meant to allow for the easy fixation of their young. There can then be a replacement of the young by an individual of another species, and in this case it produces, in place of the homophysial complex constituted by the union of the parent and the young, a heterophysial complex constituted by the assemblage of an individual and its parasitic host. The modifications of metabolism, as well as all the morphological modifications that accompany them, are approximately the same in the case of a heterophysial complex and that of a homophysial complex. A saculinated male crab takes on a form comparable to that of a female. A pregnant female has the same reactions as a parasited animal. Moreover, the asymmetrical relation of parasitism leads the parasite to a regression. In the majority of parasitic species, it is impossible to speak of an adaptation to parasitism, since this adaptation is a destruction of the organs that guarantee the being's individual autonomy. For example, the loss of the intestines frequently occurs in animals that, after having sought a host, settle themselves and nourish themselves at the expense of their host. It is not a question of an adaptation in the absolute sense of the term, but of a regression of the parasite's level of organization that ends up transforming the entire heterophysial complex into a being that does not have a level of organization superior to that of a veritable individual. It even seems that the level of organization in the heterophysial complex is inferior to that of a single individual, since in the parasited being there is no progress, but instead phenomena of anamorphosis, which I guess is like morphological regression. Perhaps it should be said that in this case, the general level of information of the heterophysial complex is equal to the difference between that of the parasited individual and that of the parasite. The parasite can be a society of individuals. When the difference tends towards zero, the heterophysial complex is no longer viable, and it dissociates either with the death of the parasited being and the liberation of the parasite, or with the parasite's death. Maybe I'll just finish this paragraph since it's finish this thought on parasitism. Thus, it would be necessary to consider a heterophysial complex as a being less than a complete individual. Should we consider the homophysial complex in the same way? Rabot tends to do so by assimilating gestation to a veritable illness. However, this point deserves to be examined. In fact, while the conclusion of the level of organization is approximately stable in the case of a heterophysial complex, this conclusion is not always the same throughout the duration of the homophysial complex. Pregnancy can correspond in certain cases to a greater resistance to infectious diseases and to cold temperatures, as if a veritable heightening of vital functions were involved. Sensitivity to chemical agents is greater and reactions are more lively, which seems to indicate an increase in an adaptive polarization of sensory activity. Motor activity can also be heightened, which seems paradoxical due to the thickening of the body and the greater expenditure of energy. It therefore seems that in this case, the relation can be somewhat additional and somewhat subtractive depending on the circumstances and the metabolism of the embryo and of the mother. In parasitism, in parasitism proper, I guess, there tends to be a decrease in the level of organization, so that you could sum it up like the total level of organization by subtracting that of the parasite from that of the host. Whereas in gestation, it's more complex, and sometimes there's an increase and sometimes there's a decrease, or maybe both at the same time in different ways.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the question here is whether we can understand the degrees of individuality of organisms in relation to whether we can understand the degree of individuality as having something to do with the relations between the individuals and other individuals. The case of parasitism is a test case for this because the question is when you have a parasite attached to another organism, does that complex make up a whole that has a greater degree of individuality? Like, are there two individuals in that complex, or does the whole complex itself compose a single individual, or something like that? That's sort of the general question that is raised in this paragraph. And so he'll argue for that in the case of parasitism, there's a decrease in the overall degree of individuality of both parties to the parasitism relationship, so both the parasite and the host. So in the case of the host, the organism suffers from the effect of parasitism is to sort of, as we'll see a little bit later, it inhibits some of the development of the organism. So the organism has a lesser degree of individuality than it would if it were not suffering from the parasite. And then in the case of the parasite, this lessening of individuality occurs in evolutionary history. So in many organisms that are specialized for parasitism, the organs that they had earlier in evolutionary history disappear or degenerate in some way. So that, like, the example that he gives here is organisms that don't have an intestine, so they can't actually assimilate food on their own anymore. They have to, the only way they can achieve nutrition is by parasitism on another organism. And then, so in contrast to this case, the case of the pregnant animal, there are cases where the pregnant animal actually has a greater, its vital functions are greater than they were prior to pregnancy, so that the host doesn't suffer the same type of loss of function or inhibition of development that occurs in the case of parasitism. And then likewise, the equivalent of the parasite, so the developing organism within the pregnant animal, it also doesn't have this degeneration over time into an organism that is only capable of parasitism. And in fact, it's the opposite, so that the developing organism initially lives in a quasi-parasitic way by absorbing nutrients from the mother, but then as it develops over time, it becomes capable of independent nutrition. So we have a disanalogy between the two cases of parasitism and pregnancy. And maybe just a note on terminology here. So he uses the two terms, homophyseal and heterophyseal. I'm not sure. I think these might be specific terms to Simondon, like he might have created these terms, or they could be biological terms that I'm not familiar with. But the meaning clearly just means of the same nature or different nature. So in the case of pregnancy, you have two organisms from the same species. So you have the growing organism inside the pregnant mother, and then they belong to the same species. So that's a homophyseal case. Whereas in the case of parasitism, you have two different species associated together, and so that's the heterophyseal case. Yeah, so footnote 33 has an explanation of these terms. I think that's added by the translator because there's no footnote in the French version. He just uses the terms and assumes that the reader will know what he's talking about. Yeah, I'm not sure why the translation puts all the notes at the end. It's kind of annoying. I'm definitely on team footnote as opposed to endnote. Yeah, it's just a publisher's thing that for whatever reason they wanted to have endnotes instead. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. So I can read a page or so. Ultimately, we must distinguish asymmetrical parasitism from the symmetrical forms of association that are symbioses, as can be seen in lichens, which are compounds of an alga that parasites a fungus and a fungus that parasites an alga. Indeed, in this case, the total quality of organization of the beings constituted in this manner exceeds that of a single individual. Indeed, in this case, the total quality of organization of the beings constituted in this manner exceeds that of a single individual. The morphological regression of each of the two beings is much less than in the case of pure parasitism, for reciprocal causality binds the two beings according to a positive reaction. The activity of each being is translated by a greater capacity of activity for the partner. On the contrary, parasitism is founded on a negative reaction that constitutes a mutual inhibition, or at the very least an inhibition exerted by the parasite on the host. Thus, in the case where a parasited male presents the characteristics of a female, this analogy is due to the inhibitory influence exerted by the parasite on its host. The secondary sexual characteristics seem to be due to a dimorphism resulting from an inhibition in the female of corresponding characteristics that develop in the male alone. This inhibition, for example, an example of that which impedes the development of skin appendages appears in parasitism. In the reciprocal association of symbiosis, like that of an alga and a fungus, this double inhibition does not appear. Here, the recurrent causality is positive, which leads to an increase in the capacities of the formed ensemble. Lichens manage to thrive and prosper with a great luxuriance where no algae or fungus can, like on a smooth concrete block exposed to frost and the intense sun in a dry atmosphere, subsisting between winter and summer in temperature differences of around 60 degrees Celsius and considerable differences in humidity. We even encounter luxuriant lichens in the tundra, where the snow covers the ground for several months at a time. These kinds of associations also describe the relationship between the hermit crab ensconced in a shell and sea anemones that settle onto the shell. The anemones would have an influence on the crab's prey, either because they attract them with their lively colors, or because they paralyze them with their stinging elements. This thus facilitating capture for the hermit crab, which is not very mobile when it is in a shell. Moreover, and inversely, the scraps of the hermit crab's food are consumed by the sea anemone. This latter detail is more certain than that which concerns the usefulness of the anemones for the hermit crab. Nevertheless, we should note that the hermit crab has the tendency to put anemones on its shell. On the shell it is sheltered in, and more generally, all objects, whether living or not, that it encounters with a lively color. In captivity, this crab grabs all the colored scraps of paper offered to it and positions them on its back. Should this reflex be considered finalized? It is quite difficult to say, and yet it seems that the crab itself is what constitutes the association, perhaps through a mimetic behavior. This is how certain zoologists interpret the reflex that ensures that this crab positions lively colored objects onto its back. But it should be recognized in this case that mimicry is quite clumsy, because on a background of gray or black sand, the crab allows itself to be covered with red or yellow, which makes it quite visible. In fact, it can be supposed without irrationality that the hermit crab constitutes this association, and that once inserted into this cycle of causality, whatever the type of reflex or tropism may be that makes the crab act, the sea anemone develops due to conditions of life that are richer than the ones offered to it by the crab's food. Lastly, we should note that here it is not a question of veritable parasitism. The sea anemone does not degenerate, but on the contrary exhibits an outstanding development. Indeed, it is nourished not due to the proboscis or suckers that inhale the substance of its host, but in a normal and habitual way. The proximity of the crab's claws and feelers merely puts it in a milieu that is richer in small assimilable debris, finds a separate individual without any physiological continuity with the crab. Furthermore, the crab does not utilize the substances elaborated by the sea anemone, which is on the shell that the crab dwells in, and yet it could be on any other shell or on a rock. Between the crab and the anemone, there is water in the shell, and this is why in this case we have a veritable society. Each individual remains individual but modifies the milieu in which the two individuals live. The relation between the individuals that form a society is established by way of the exterior milieu, and this is why there is a great difference between the cases of parasitism and those of association in the regime of causality and the exchange of information. The regime of inter-individual causality is completely different. We should also note that an alga and a fungus associated as a lichen are, in fact, for one another elements of the exterior milieu and not of the interior milieu. Following Schwendener's theory, the alga assimilates carbon through its chlorophyll, which is beneficial to the fungus, and the fungus protects the alga against desiccation by means of its filaments, which shelter it and allow it to live where it would have certainly died alone. This relation of two beings that are an equivalent of the exterior milieu through one another can include different topological modalities, but always with the same functional role. The thallus is differentiated from the apothecia. In certain species, the fungal filaments can be more concentrated in the periphery, constituting what is called the lichen's cortex, while the center is the medulla, and the intermediate region is what contains the gonidia, cells of green algae analogous to those of rocks and soil. This lichen is called heteromeric. I guess I'll just finish this section here. On the contrary, in homomeric lichen, such as gelatinous lichen, the distribution of the fungal filaments and algae cells is homogeneous. Lastly, it should be noted that this association goes up to the reproductive elements, including both the algae and the fungus. The soredia contains both the cells of the algae and the filaments of the fungus. These fragments detach from the lichen and are used for its multiplication. In contrast, the fructifications seem to belong to the fungus alone. They are composed of a hymeneum, as in ascomycetic fungi, whose cells are asci intermixed with other sterile cells, the paraphyses, and are where spores form. Here, the association constitutes like a second individuality that is superposed on the individuality of the beings that are associated without destroying this individuality. Here, there is a reproductive system of society qua society, and a reproductive system of the fungus qua fungus. The association does not destroy the individualities of the individuals that constitute it. On the contrary, the parasitic type of relation reduces the individuality of the beings. That of placentation is intermediate. It can evolve in one of two directions, both toward that of society as well as that of parasitism. Furthermore, it is highly evolutive, and in this sense is transformed. Like parasitism, the association is static. It is important to note this aspect both in the case of stable states as well as in the case of placentation, i.e. the homophysio-parasitism that tends to become a temporary society. It seems in this sense possible to consider all forms of association as mixtures of parasitism and of the perfect society that ends in the formation of a veritable secondary social individuality, a compound like the one that appears in the algae fungus grouping. There is no association that is exempt from a certain parasitism and thus from a certain regression that reduces the individuality of the beings grouped together. But moreover, pure parasitism is rare since it tends to destroy itself through a sort of internal necrosis that it develops in the group within which parasitism takes place, making this group's level of organization fall to a very low level. The concrete group can be considered as intermediate between complete society and pure parasitism, where the level of organization that characterizes the group is the difference between that of the parasited and that of the parasite. So here, this long, like 3-page paragraph is about distinguishing the case of what's sometimes called commensalism, so mutual association, as opposed to parasitism, in which one organism serves as the host and the other one as the parasite. So the key examples that he talks about here are the case of lichens, and the case of the crab and the anemone. And lichens are especially interesting because they're completely interwoven with each other. And so a lichen is made up of an alga and a fungus that grow together. And as Simondon mentions here, the lichen, the associated form, can live in environments where neither form on its own, neither of the two associated organisms on their own can survive. So lichens grow on bare rock where the alga would not be able to survive on its own. And then the fungus would not be able to survive there either because it wouldn't have any source of nutrients. But the association of the alga and the fungus together is able to survive in this very harsh environment of bare rock. And lichens actually break down rock over the long term. And so that's like part of the formation of soils, I think, if I'm not mistaken, is breakdown of rocks by lichen over many thousands of years. Yeah, so these associations are very effective in sort of allowing organisms to survive and prosper in environments where they wouldn't be able to otherwise. And the specific species of algae and fungus that form lichens are completely specialized for that association. So they reproduce in such a way that they have to grow into a lichen. They don't appear as independent algae and fungus outside of the lichen association. So yeah, that's the one example of that's like a stock example in biology of commensalism. And then the other example that Simondon talks about is the case of the hermit crab that that puts the anemone on its shell. So the specific benefit to the hermit crab is not 100% clear, at least at the time that Simondon was writing. So it could be that the anemone's stingers will paralyze the prey, and then which allows the crab to grasp it more easily. Or it could be that the colors of the anemone attract prey, or it could be something else completely. But in any case, the fact that the crab actually actively goes out and puts the anemone on its back suggests that there's some sort of function that the anemone is performing for the crab. Like presumably, if the crab actually puts the anemone on its back, it is getting something out of it as well. And then the other side is that the anemone gets all the scraps from the crab's food. They float around and the anemone can grab them. So the difference between, so in this case compared to a parasitism, the reason why this is not a case of parasitism is that the crab and the anemone are completely distinct physiologically. Like there's no physiological connection between them. There's a shell that separates the crab from the anemone. And remember also that hermit crabs are the ones that they take the shells that they find from other organisms. So the shell is not even attached to the body of the hermit crab. And so yeah, there's no physiological connection between the anemone and the hermit crab. And they each, neither party to this association has the degeneration or the simplification that's characteristic of a relation of parasitism. So yeah, that's why we would want to distinguish this case of association from the case of parasitism.
So when he talks about the concrete group at the end of that long paragraph, he says it can be considered as an intermediate between complete society and pure parasitism. I wasn't sure what he was referring to there, because it seems like there isn't really anything parasitic in the crab anemone relationship or the lichen relationship, because of this physiological separation that you were talking about.
Yeah. So in this case, so there's I guess we can think about degrees of parasitism. So to the extent that the crab is dependent on its association with the anemone, or if it's more capable of surviving and reproducing and everything when it's in an association with the anemone, then to that extent it is we can characterize it as a relationship of parasitism, only to the extent that the crab is no longer fully independent of the association with the anemone.
Okay, that makes
yeah. So the fact that or in the case of the lichen is even a stronger instance of this, where the two component organisms are completely dependent on each other to survive in the environments that the lichen normally grows in. So there's the degree of individuality of the component organisms is lesser than it would be if they were living as separate organisms. So to that extent, there's a certain amount of parasitism in these relationships, even though in other respects the relationship is very different from the more straightforward instances of parasitism.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It seems like a lot of inter-individual relations would have some degree of parasitism in this sense.
Yeah, and even if we look at the other side, like in the case of what we would unambiguously call parasites, there's also in that relationship there's some degree of association, in the sense that the interest of the parasite is for the host to survive and be able to continue to provide nutrition to the parasite. So if the parasite kills off its host too quickly, then the parasite itself will die or won't be able to reproduce, and so that's not in its interest either. So that there's a certain degree of shared interest between the parasite organism and the host organism, even though in other respects the parasite is living at the expense of the host organism, and they have opposed interests.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah, so there's in each case, so we never have a pure case of 100% parasitism or 100% mutuality. Each case that is each case that we find is a mixture of the two, with varying amounts, either tending towards mutuality or tending towards parasitism, but in some mixture.
I thought that this, where he's talking about in the middle of that last page on 221, he talks about the reproductive system of society qua society. That sounds like a good definition of like the abstract machine in Deleuze and Guattari, at least as I understand it.
I don't remember that as well as I should, to be able to comment on whether or not that makes sense. Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure.
I mean, I guess I understand it as sort of the something emergent in the like the wasp orchid hybrid. I guess there's a way that society of different animals reproduces itself as something separate from the the wasp and the orchid on their own.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. So in the case of the lichen, so even in like the actual physiological structure of the reproductive system of the two component organisms, so they produce this what is it called, this soredia, I believe, this structure that contains both the alga and soredia. It contains cells of the alga and of the fungus that it then goes on to grow and reproduce. So the actual association of the fungus and the alga is itself reproduced. And so the lichen as such is what reproduces rather than each individual component of the lichen. Yeah, one bit that I think would be interesting to look at is when he talks here about societies, the formation of societies and the social social individuality. So the idea of a perfect society would be an association in which there would be a production of this secondary individuality, but in such a way that there's no degree of parasitism. So there's no reduction of the individuality of the components. So it's as if the lichen case were to come about in a way that the alga and the fungus would preserve their individuality completely, and then you would have a second order organism or second order individuation on top of the individuation of the alga and the fungus, and so the lichen would form like a second level of individuality on top of the first one. So that's this idea of this perfect society. But I'm interested in how this understanding of a social organization maps onto what he mentioned earlier in the first chapter of this part, where he distinguishes between societies and the trans-individual collective, and what was the third form? I forget. There were three.
The inter-individual, maybe.
Right. Yes. Yeah. The inter-individual. That's right. So we have the society. On the one hand, is set out as being constituted of differentiated individuals, so that each individual has an assigned function in the society that it's specialized in, and then the inter-individual is sort of a relationship between already constituted individuals, and I guess the paradigm example of that would be like economic exchange in a human society, where you have parties that are treated as being equal parties that exchange goods in some way after, like, they're already constituted individuals, and then they come into this exchange relationship. And then the trans individual is this collective individuation that takes place. So it's a re-individuation of the organism or of the individual that takes place in this collective form. So I'd be interested to see how this concept of the perfect society that he's developing here, how it maps onto that earlier discussion and the specific meaning that he gives to the term society in that context. Maybe just before we go on to the next bit, we can I'll just mention that there's a couple of footnotes throughout that long paragraph that are basically just explaining the relationship between the fungus and the alga in the lichen. And so those are, they're worth looking at just to have some more notes about how it works. Like the basic idea is that the alga performs photosynthesis. So it absorbs energy from sunlight and produces sugars out of the carbon in the air. And then the fungus absorbs nutrients from the alga, and at the same time it protects the alga from drying out. So that's the sort of general relationship between the two components of the lichen. But there's some more stuff in the footnotes if you're interested to take a look at lichens in more detail. Okay, so let's start subsection 3, if someone else would like to read.
Subsection 3, individuation, information, and the structure of the individual. The very important question that is yet to be posed is one that consists in knowing what the structure of individuality is. Where does the organizing dynamism of the individual reside? Is it consubstantial with the individual, or instead is it localized in some fundamental elements that would regulate the ensemble of the individual organism? This is the question posed for all individuals, and also particularly for those that undergo metamorphoses, which is a sort of reproduction of the being on the basis of itself, a reproduction without multiplication, a reproduction of unity and identity, but without similarity, during which the being becomes completely other while remaining an individual, which seems to show that the individuality does not reside in self-resemblance and in the fact of not being modified, thus leading us to exclude the idea of an individuality fully consubstantial with the whole being. The research conducted by biologists have borne either on the development of the egg, Dalk's studies on the egg and its organizing dynamism, or the metamorphoses of certain animals, particularly those of the insects, in which the passage through the nymph stage implies an important reorganization of the organism after a quite extensive de-differentiation. In the first case, it seems that differentiation by far precedes the appearance of anatomically and cytologically distinct regions. In the stage of the division into macromeres and micromeres, an ablation on one part of the egg already produces the disappearance or atrophy of a particular part of the body, although we might think it would operate on a continuous mass. The continuum is already heterogeneous, as if a veritable polarity appeared in the egg, barely beginning to be segmented. In the nymph, several imaginal discs direct the reorganization of a mass that has undergone a profound de-differentiation. The individual structure can therefore be reduced to several elements starting from which it extends to the whole mass. This theory of organizers seems to indicate that living matter can be the basis of certain fields that are poorly known and that can neither be measured nor revealed by any currently known procedure. They can only be compared to the formation of crystals, or rather crystalline figures in a supersaturated milieu, or a milieu that is in other conditions favorable to crystallization. But this case is not absolutely analogous, since the crystal is indefinite in its growth in principle, whereas the individual seems to have limits. Truly speaking, the formation of crystals would instead be comparable to the growth of a colony, which doesn't develop in any specific direction, in any specific way, but according to directions that it favors during its development. There is an orientation at the basis of these two processes. A polarity, there's an orientation at the basis of these two processes, a polarity that makes it such that the individual being is capable of growing and reproducing with a certain polarity, i.e. analogically with respect to itself, based on its organizing germs in a transductive way, insofar as this property of analogy is not exhausted. Analogy relative to itself is characteristic of the individual being, and it is the property that allows us to recognize the latter. There is a preparation of individuality every time that a polarity is created, every time that an asymmetrical qualification, an orientation, and an order appear. The condition of individuation resides in this existence of potentials that allow matter to be polarized, whether living or not. Furthermore, there is a reversibility between the condition of polarity and the existence of potentials. Every field makes polarities appear in initially non-oriented milieus, like a field of mechanical forces in a portion of glass, which modifies its optical properties, for example. However, until now, studies on the polarization of matter, as interesting and suggestive as they may be, have remained fragmentary and partially uncoordinated. An entire theory of polarization is to be made that would no doubt further clarify the rapport of what we call living matter or organized matter and inert or inorganic matter. It indeed seems that non-living matter is already organizable and that this organization precedes any passage to functional life, as if organization were a sort of intermediate static life between inorganic reality and functional life, properly speaking. The latter would be that in which a being reproduces itself, whereas in non-living matter, the individual indeed produces effects on other individuals, but does not generally produce individuals similar to it. The physical individual does not convey any other message than its own capacity to grow. It is not, quote-unquote, hereditary substance, to use the expression by which Rabot designates the living individual. Thus, a photoelectron falling onto a target can emit secondary electrons, which are many from a single photoelectron. But these secondary electrons are not the descendants of the first electron or photoelectron. They are the descendants of other electrons emitted at the moment of the photoelectron striking against a metal plate, photomultiplier tubes, or against a molecule of gas, ionization chamber. So one distinction that I think he's drawing here that isn't entirely clear to me is this distinction between self-resemblance and analogy relative, self-analogy, basically. It seems like he's rejecting the idea of self-resemblance, which would exclude eggs, basically, or animals that undergo metamorphosis. But there's something about self-analogy that allows for the preservation of the individual in a way that self-resemblance does not.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's sort of the key point of this paragraph is to make that distinction. So the idea, maybe like a sort of naive idea of what the individuality of a being would consist in is the fact that it resembles itself over time. So the organism at time t1 is going to resemble organism at time t2, and so on. That would be sort of like a first pass at how you would try to explain the individuality of an organism over time. But the problem with that is, of course, that there is the organisms undergo development and change over time to, in some organisms, very high degrees of change. So in the case of insects that have a larval or a nymph stage, they will, like butterflies, for example, they're born as, or they're hatched as caterpillars, and then they have one sort of mode of life where they eat leaves or whatever for a certain amount of time, and then they form a chrysalis, and then they undergo a process of de-differentiation of all the organs that existed in the caterpillar, and then they emerge after a while as a butterfly with a completely different mode of life where they feed off of flowers and so on. So there's not a lot of resemblance in terms of the properties or the mode of life or anything like that between a caterpillar and a butterfly, and and so this is the problem of what does the individuality of a butterfly over its lifespan consist in, that includes both the caterpillar stage and the butterfly stage. And so this notion of analogy, I think, like, we always have to, whenever he uses the term analogy, we always have to think of transduction, because already in the introduction he talked about how transduction is what is valid about analogical reasoning. And so transduction is both a mode of thinking and an aspect of reality. And in this case, he's talking about this aspect of reality. So there's a transductive relationship between the larval form or the nymph form of the organism and the adult form. So in this case, he's talking about how there's a certain polarization of either the egg or the undifferentiated state of the caterpillar inside the chrysalis. So it takes on this undifferentiated form, but within that undifferentiated form, there's still this polarization. So there's one end that goes on to form the head, and one end that forms the tail, and there's an up and down direction, and so on. So the what appears to be a homogeneous egg or homogeneous mass undergoing metamorphosis has this differentiation within it in this mysterious way, and then the transformation of that homogeneous mass into a differentiated individual occurs along those axes of polarization. So there's a gradual transformation of the homogeneous mass into this structured, differentiated individual. And so he's comparing that to, or he's describing that as a transductive operation. So he's comparing it to the case of the crystal that crystallizes gradually across the whole mass of liquid in which the seed is implanted. So this is why it's a transductive or analogical relationship between the different stages of the organism, rather than a relationship of resemblance, because the capacity for the transformation is part of the concept of a transductive relationship, whereas in the case of resemblance, that capacity for transformation is not is actually excluded from that concept. And then there's and so he compares the growth of or the development of the egg from the undifferentiated state in which it appears at the early stages into a differentiated organism. So he compares that development to the growth of a crystal, but it differs in certain respects as well, because in the case of the egg, there's a certain stage. So at the earliest stages of the growth of the egg, you can cut off a portion of the egg, and then it still grows into an individual organism that looks the same as a normal one. It'll be a little bit smaller is all. But then once you reach a certain stage in the development of the egg, even though the egg looks externally like it's a homogeneous mass of material, if you cut off a portion of it, then the organism will develop missing a portion of its body. So already at the stage, even though the egg looks homogeneous, you already at that stage, there's a portion that corresponds to the head, and another portion that corresponds to one of the limbs, and so on. and so removing any portion of that egg will result in a mutilated organism that develops out of the egg. Whereas in the case of the crystal, there's no sort of overall structure of the crystal. So if you take a crystal and cut off a piece of it and then allow it to put it back in the solution and allow it to grow again, it just grows around that part that you cut off in the same way as it grows everywhere else. So there's no overall structure. There's no sort of general form of the crystal that it has to fit. So that's one difference between the case of the crystal growth and the case of the development of an organism out of an egg. And so because of this disanalogy or this difference between the two cases, he says that actually the better analogy is between the growth of the crystal and the growth of a colony in the case of these organisms that have this colony form. So the colony, like the crystal, has a certain structure. We saw, I think last week or the week before, there's this particular kind of organism where the colony always has a cross shape because the four outermost organisms survive and the ones on the inside die off and form like a sort of core around which the four external ones grow. And so the colony has this overall structure, and then other organisms, the colony has this overall shape that is always preserved through growth. Likewise, the crystal has this the crystalline structure that is characteristic of a crystal formed of that substance, but there's no sort of guiding principle of differentiation or something like that. There's nothing like, again, if you cut off a piece of a crystal, there's nothing that makes the crystal regrow the portion that you cut off. It just grows around that portion in the way that it would grow if you hadn't cut it. So because of this, the stricter analogy is between the growth of a colony and the growth of the crystal, and so that's a closer analogy than the development of the egg to the growth of a crystal.
One thing that this section made me think of is it seems like this argument against self-resemblance could also be an argument against, I guess, ethical positions based on an idea of authenticity that is, kind of like coincidence with yourself. But maybe it also leaves open the possibility of an idea of authenticity based on self-analogy rather than self-resemblance.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. So something like, I don't know, like you hear sort of I don't know, pop culture or pop psychology kind of advice or self-help kind of advice that you hear people say that you have to be true to yourself or something like that, which would suggest that there's something like some core set of properties or essence of a person that they can that persists throughout life, that the individual has to in some way orient their behavior towards, so that there would be some sort of harmony or accordance between the behavior and this personal essence or something like that. So that type of representation of ethics would be that would fall under the case of the self-resemblance type of position that Simondon was criticizing here. What would be more interesting is to see if, as you suggested, if you can come up with an account of something like authenticity that would be an authenticity that is developed through transformation. So it would be this analogical relationship rather than a relationship of self-resemblance. So rather than having something like an essence of a person that has to be preserved or that behavior has to be in accordance with, there would be something like a process of self-transformation over time in such a way that each stage of the development or the transformation is arises out of the preceding one in some sort of harmonious or suitable way, whatever exactly that means. But it would be an ethics of self-transformation rather than an ethics of corresponding to a personal essence. And then there's in this, he starts to introduce a contrast in non-living matter or vital individuation and physical individuation in a more, what he sets out as the distinction between the two is that in the case of living organisms or in vital individuation, the individual reproduces itself. So there's this analogical relationship between the individual and itself over time, or this transductive relationship of the individual over time to itself. Whereas in the case of physical individuation, there's no self-reproduction. There's only the production of effects of various kinds, and so the case that he points to here is well, I think he actually makes it more sort of specific than he needs to. But in the case of an electron that strikes a metal plate, so you have one electron that's fired at the plate, and then when it strikes the plate, there's an emission of secondary electrons. So there's a sort of reproduction of electrons at work here, but it's not. There's nothing about the secondary electrons that is sort of a product of the first electron. There's no sort of relation of descendants between the first electron and the secondary electrons. The secondary electrons have no properties that they derive from the fact that they derive from the first electron. So in this sense, it's not the initial electron is not reproducing itself. It's just producing an effect, which is to release these secondary electrons from the metal plate. And so there's no, even though there's at one sort of level of analysis, you can describe it as a reproduction. It's more precisely, it's not actually a reproduction. It's just the production of effects. And so this is this example is sort of illustrates the way that physical individuation differs from vital individuation. So yeah, I promised a while ago that we were done with quantum physics, but there's actually a little bit still here, so you can't escape it. There's not too much. There's just this one passage, I think, in this bit. But yeah, so I'll read the next page or so here. In these conditions, the individuality and origin of the first electron hardly matters. It can involve a photoelectron, but also a thermoelectron, thyrotron, or an electron emitted by some other procedure, for example, with the ionization of a gas, a Geiger counter. The result does not change for the emission of secondary electrons, and for example, there is no way to discriminate the secondary electrons originating from the multiplication of the electrons of the dark current of an ionization chamber or of a photomultiplier from those that originate from veritable photoelectrons. There's no individual marking of electrons and not even a specific marking in terms of their origin, at least with the procedures of measurement at our disposal. On the other hand, this marking is possible in physiology, and it seems to constitute one of the profound characteristics of individuality, linking the individual back to its particular genesis. regeneration, which supposes an immanence of the organizing schema for each individual, and a conservation within it of the dynamism by which it has been produced, does not seem to exist in physics. A sawed-off crystal does not regenerate when it is put back into a mother liquor. It continues to grow, but without favoring the side that was amputated. On the contrary, a living being is activated and disturbed by a severance, and its growth occurs much more actively on the side of the amputation than on the surfaces that remain intact, as if the immanence of an organizing dynamism distinguished the surface that has undergone a severance. Perhaps it is not possible to predict the point on which research would have to bear in order to clarify this relation between individuality and polarization. Nevertheless, another aspect of the question is beginning to emerge that is different from the previous one, but no doubt connected to it. A possible path of study is situated in the interval that separates these two directions and in the sector that they mark out without structuring it. This second research is the one that is preoccupied with determining the relation between quanta and life. The quantum aspect of physics is found in biology and is perhaps one of the characteristics of individuation. It would be that one of the principles of organization is a functional quantum law that defines the thresholds of the functioning of the organs and thus effectuates organization. The nervous system, whatever its degree of complexity may be, is not merely composed of an array of chemical conductors. Between these electrochemical conductors, there is a relational system on several levels, a systemics that presents characteristics of operation that are akin to what is called relaxation in physics, and what is sometimes called in physiology the all or nothing. Anglo-American biologists and neurologists willingly use the expression to fire, to discharge like a gun, in order to characterize this operation, which supposes that a certain quantity of potential energy is accumulated and then exerts its effect completely and all of a sudden, not continuously. Not only do the different effectors appear to function according to this law, but the centers themselves, which are organized as an interconnection of relays that facilitate or inhibit one another, are regulated by this law. Thus, although in an organism everything is linked back to everything else physiologically speaking, various and structured regimes of causality can be established due to the laws of quantum functionalities. A quantity that does not reach a certain threshold is virtually null for all the relays that are temporarily at a certain level of triggering, and the message that is transmitted by this information is guided only down the paths where passage is possible with an operation of relays that have a threshold below the energetic level of the message considered. These characteristics of operation can furthermore be something besides the pure quantity of energy. A temporal modulation can intervene, for example, a frequency, but certainly less universally than Lapix would think at the time when he established the theory of synaptic relays with the notion of chronaxie. It would seem that this operation, which creates a structured regime of information in an individual, should require a preliminary morphological differentiation with the nervous system in particular. Yet it could be precisely that quantum actions exerted on the level of the large molecules of organic chemistry find a facilitation or an inhibition in certain directions according to a law of thresholds based on the quantum properties of energy exchanges. And then there would be a root of organization as a heterogeneity of paths of exchange in a mass that is nevertheless continuous. Before any anatomical differentiation, the heterogeneously continuous supplies, through a slight quantity of energy, the first elements of a regime of the conditioning of the exercise of a greater quantity of potential energy, which is the starting point of a regime of information in a milieu and makes possible the processes of amplification. I'll just read this last paragraph here too. Perhaps the separation between the physical individual and the living individual could be established by means of the following criterion. Information in the operation of physical individuation is not distinct from the supports of the potential energy that is actualized in the manifestations of organization. In this sense, there would be no remote relays without life. On the contrary, individuation in the living being would be founded on the distinction between the modulating structures and the supports of potential energy implied in the operations characterizing the individual. The structure and dynamism of relays would therefore be essential to the living individual, and this is why, according to this hypothesis, it would be possible to define different levels in the regime of information for the physical individual and for the living individual. The living being is itself a modulator. It has a power supply in energy, an input or a memory, and an effector system. The physical individual requires the milieu as a source of energy and as an effector charge. The milieu supplies information, receives singularity. So he's developing the point further about the electrons. So it's just what I was mentioning a little bit earlier about how in the case of the electrons, there's no way to distinguish the source electron in terms of its nature. So the secondary electrons that are emitted after the first electron hits the metal plate, those secondary electrons don't convey any information about the nature of the first electron, so how it was generated in the first place. So there's nothing like there's no form of reproduction of the electron in this production of secondary electrons, in the sense that there's no transductive relationship between the initial electron and the electrons that are emitted afterwards. And then he also points to, in the case of physical individuation, the case of the crystal, where once you cut off a portion of the crystal and then put it back into the liquid, it just continues to grow in the same way as it was growing before. It doesn't do anything to sort of regenerate the portion that was cut off or something like that. Whereas with living organisms, even in cases where an organism is not capable of regenerating a limb or something like that, there's growth of scar tissue. So there's a differentiated growth in terms of the portion that is amputated. So what he calls here the organizing dynamism of the living individual is maintained across the whole body of the individual, whereas in the case of the crystal, there's only I guess the equivalent of the organizing dynamism would just be the surface of the crystal that brings about the crystallization of an initial layer of the surrounding fluid, but there's no overall organizing dynamism in the sense of a principle that structures the crystal as a. And then he goes on to this bit about quantum physics and its relation to biology, which is a little bit weird, I would say. But he sort of prefaces this by saying that it's an area that needs to be researched more, and it's not even entirely clear exactly what type of research would be required in order to get the required knowledge about this relationship, because it's not a strictly a question of quantum physics, and it's not a biology question in the sort of traditional sense either. So it's some sort of like physics biology interaction or something like that is what we need. And then so what the point where he sort of makes the connection between quantum physics and biology is the fact that many biological processes, and in particular the functioning of nervous systems, involve some sort of threshold effect. So like in nerve cells, there's some sort of input that comes in, and if that input is below a certain threshold, then the nerve cell does nothing. And then if the input is above a certain threshold, then the nerve cell will fire and send a signal onto the other nerve cells that are connected to it. And so it has this all or nothing response to input, and so he's comparing this to the in the case of microphysics. So in the case of subatomic particles, there's a similar all or nothing effect in the sense that there's discrete quanta of action. So for example, the electrons can only appear at certain orbits around the atomic nucleus, and if energy is input it into the system, then the electron will pass from one orbit to another one without inhabiting the intermediate stages or intermediate energy states. So he's comparing this discreteness of the effect in neurons to the discreteness in effect in subatomic particles. And then he's suggesting that, and this is sort of given as a speculative suggestion, but the suggestion here is that in the case of the large molecules that make up a living organism, so the organic compounds in an organism, there could be some sort of effect of the quantum processes, the subatomic interactions that have this discrete nature could be either inhibited or facilitated by the structure of these large organic compounds, so that the discreteness of effect in living organisms would be a consequence of the discreteness of effect in the case of subatomic particles that would just be sort of amplified by these organic compounds. But yeah, he gives this as a sort of speculative suggestion and not something that has been established by research yet.
Two thoughts about the discussion you made so far. Okay. You've finished it? What do you want to say? Or
yeah.
Can I say?
Yeah.
Yeah, first one is it's quite interesting. You point out why quantum physics come in here. I think that has to do with we should go back to the first question here. Simongdong presented in the beginning of this part. So going back to the very first part, and the question he posed, where does organizing dynamism of the individual reside? Is it consubstantial with the individual, or instead is it localized in some of the fundamental elements that would regulate the ensemble, the individual organism, something like that? Here, what I understood is that we can't find the hereditary origin of the all individuation. Instead, every genesis has its own singularity. I think we can't trace origin. We can only trace elements of each genesis. Because, as far as I understand in this section, it seems that we can't his kind of a conclusion is that the individuality, not the consubstantial, right? The whole being, each transformation, change is derived from it's different kind of a mechanism of the transformation. So we can't bring any kind of linear process of development. So in order to explain, I think Simongdong brought up quantum physics here in terms of the mechanism of the as far as I understand, quantum physics, it shows the probability of the existence, probability of possibility, probability of the how do I say, the how quantum, how it could well, of course, physics is physics, but if you think quantum physics, the mechanism, it has to do with the multiple probability of. I mean, it's quite different from the Newton's classical, the thermodynamic. I mean, physics or something like that. We can't exactly explain the why something can coexist at the same time. Even we can think of like a much more possibilities, like in terms of spatial temporality. So in order to singular process of synthesis, quantum physics is needed, like in terms of the movement of the quantum as a kind of like element of the whole transformation. It's kind of random thinking, but I hope I can get some ideas from you.
Yeah, so I think I'm not sure if the role of the quantum physics here is exactly a role of a mechanism that he's setting out for individuation. I think what he wants to do here is to contrast physical and vital individuation. So he wants to explain the difference between the individuation of physical at the physical level and then the individuation at the vital level. But he also wants to suggest at least that there's some sort of analogy or even I guess you could call it a grounding of the vital individuation in certain properties of physical individuation. So it's precisely that discreteness of action in the case of vital individuation that he wants to point back towards the discreteness of action in the case of quantum physics. Yeah, so I think the role of quantum physics here is both as a contrast to the case of vital individuation, and then also as a point of I don't know, a point of origin, I guess you could say, of this discrete quality of action in the case of vital individuation. So yeah, I think that's what the connection here is, or why he introduces quantum physics again at this point. And I think also there's so he first introduces this so he introduces this contrast between, like, the example of the electron, where the secondary electrons produced by the first electron don't give us any information about the initial electron that strikes the metal plate. So in that case, we have a lack of any sort of information transmission, or a lack of a relationship of information between the initial electron and the secondary electrons. Whereas in the case of vital individuation, even when you have, for example, the insect that has a larval state and then undergoes dedifferentiation, and then emerges as an adult form later on, even in that case, you have this relationship, this analogical or transductive relationship between the one stage and the subsequent stages, so that we can understand the whole process as a self-production or self-reproduction of the organism. So that's sort of the first step of how we get back into this quantum physics, is that contrast between the two cases. And then in the next paragraph here, he points to, instead of the contrast, the actual connection between quantum physics and vital individuation, and in particular in relation with this notion of polarization. So this idea that within the continuous there is some sort of differentiation that sets out opposed directions of growth, for example, or sets out a distinction between the head and the tail within an egg, or some other beginning of differentiation within the continuous, and so he sees this beginning of differentiation within the continuous as being characteristic of the genesis of an individual. So once you have that appearance of polarization, that means that the potential energy within this continuous or homogeneous field can then be structured by this at least just a distinction of direction between front and back, or up and down, or whatever it is. That's sort of like the minimal distinction that's required in order to begin the genesis of an individual. And then he's suggesting that this distinction sort of constitutes the distinction between the living and the physical levels of individuation. So in the case of the physical individual, there's no distinction between the support of the potential energy and the operation of the individuation itself. So it's there's no distinction between the two. Whereas in the case of the vital individuation, we have a distinction between the level of the living individual, the distinction between the level of the information structure and then the level of the potential energy that underlies that information structure. So we have the living being contains an energy source within itself, and it modulates the flow of energy, we can say, I guess, from the environment into that energy source, and in a way that the physical individual doesn't.
So kind of like let me clarify like my question. Like firstly, like I would like to ask again, like the key point of this section is that like Simong-dong says that like we don't know exactly like why all the different like a singular process of genesis take place, right? And then if it's so, and then in order to explain why the existing idea then when Simong-dong lived doesn't suffice like the whole kind of can't explain the whole process. I said that's why he brought up quantum physics, which was kind of like a popular like at the moment, a little bit like a little bit budding, initiating like period as far as I understand. But anyways, like a quantum physics can explain like a microscopic world, unlike like the existing like the classical physics. So we can more we can be more into the microscopic world, what could happen in terms of probability. So at the end of the day, like the singularity of the all different kind of a process. Because here, I think like Simon don't think like it's impossible for us like to find like a crystal. What kind of milieu like a particular make a different kind of a process of individuation, something like that. Am I totally like misinterpreting the whole section?
No, I don't think you're totally misinterpreting it. I think that the question about the singularity is a good one, because I think it's connected to something that we've talked about a few times, which is in the case of the crystal example that he comes back to all the time. The question is, what is the initial germ of crystallization, or what is the initial singularity around which the crystal forms? And he sort of hesitates around this question. I think he doesn't like in a text that we read before we started this book, which is included as an appendix in the full book. So it's the text form information potentials. In that text, there's a discussion portion, and someone asks him about these initial germs, and then he says something like, we would hesitate to ascribe a role of chance here, or something like that. I forget the exact wording, but he sort of brings up the possibility that there's some sort of role of chance in the formation of the singularity around which a crystal grows. But then he sort of hesitates to actually assert that there is this chance component or something like that in the case of crystallization. And I think that's a point of difficulty for him in general, is where that first singularity arises from. And so one sort of line of approach would be to look at quantum physics or the microscopic subatomic realm as sort of providing that source of chance around which the crystal can grow, or around which individuation can happen. But I think, I mean, not to sort of get into too much in the last couple minutes here about quantum physics, but the interpretation of quantum physics that Simondon ascribes to is an interpretation in which there is no role for chance in the way that there is in the orthodox interpretation of quantum physics. So that, it's the double solution again. So that in this interpretation, so the sort of family of interpretations that the double solution theory belongs to is sometimes called the causal interpretation, because it has a role for causality as opposed to chance. There's no notion of an autonomous chance or a self-subsistent chance or something like that, like there is in the orthodox interpretation. So I think Simondon would not want to see quantum physics as like the source of singularities through chance in that way. But he does suggest that there's something like an amplification of quantum processes, which is characteristic of vital individuation, so that the complex organic molecules that make up a living being would sort of amplify the quantum effects, and that would be the ultimate source of the discreteness of action that is characteristic of vital individuation. So yeah, I think the sort of short answer is that I think this is a sort of problem point for Simondon's philosophy, and I don't think he has a good answer to that question.
Okay, thank you, Erica. Let me think it and then twice, and then and then maybe like next week we can figure out more.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and you can post it in the chat, and if I see it over the week, I'll try to answer as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so we're about at time here. So let's end here for today, and then we'll pick up from the beginning of section 4 of the chapter next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, and see you all next week.